In the spring of 1898, the United States went to war with Spain, and when the smoke cleared just a few months later, America found itself in possession of an empire stretching across 2 oceans. The Spanish-American War lasted only 10 weeks, but its consequences would reshape the Pacific and cost hundreds of thousands of lives in a conflict most Americans today have never heard of. This is the story of how the United States took the Philippines from Spain, promised freedom to the Filipino people, and then spent years fighting a brutal war to suppress their independence movement. A war that killed over 200,000 Filipinos and transformed America from a republic into a colonial power. The story begins not in Manila or Washington, but in Havana Harbor on the night of February 15, 1898. The USS Maine, an American battleship sent to protect U.S. interests during Cuba's war for independence from Spain, exploded and sank, killing 266 American sailors. Nobody knew what caused the explosion. It might have been an accident, a coal bunker fire igniting the ship's ammunition magazines, or it might have been a mine. But American newspapers, led by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, weren't interested in uncertainty. They wanted a story and they wanted a villain. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became the rallying cry that swept across America. Within weeks, the country was demanding war, and President William McKinley, despite his personal reluctance, gave them what they wanted. But here's what most people don't realize. The Spanish-American War wasn't really about Cuba, or at least not just about Cuba. For years, American businessmen, politicians, and naval strategists had been eyeing Spain's colonial possessions with increasing interest. Cuba was the most obvious target, just 90 miles from Florida, where American companies had invested millions in sugar plantations. But there was another prize, halfway around the world, that had caught the attention of America's expansionist-minded leaders. The Philippine Islands, an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands in the western Pacific, had been a Spanish colony for over 300 years. And in the thinking of men like Theodore Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, the Philippines represented something crucial, a stepping stone to the markets of China and a naval base that would make America a Pacific power. The thing is, the Filipinos had been fighting for their independence from Spain long before America entered the picture. For decades, Filipino intellectuals, reformers, and revolutionaries had been organizing, writing, and fighting against Spanish colonial rule. The most important figure in this movement was José Rizal, a doctor, writer, and polymath who wrote novels exposing the cruelty and corruption of Spanish rule. Rizal didn't advocate violence. He believed in reform, education, and peaceful change. But the Spanish colonial authorities saw him as dangerous anyway, and in December 1896, they executed him by firing squad in Manila. His death turned him into a martyr and ignited a full-scale revolution. The leader of that revolution was Emilio Aguinaldo, a young man from a wealthy family in Cavite province. Aguinaldo was only 29 years old when he became the head of the revolutionary movement, but he proved to be a skilled military commander and political organizer. By early 1897, his forces controlled significant parts of Luzon, the main island of the Philippines. The Spanish, realizing they couldn't completely crush the rebellion, negotiated a deal. They paid Aguinaldo and his top leaders 400,000 pesos and promised reforms in exchange for going into exile in Hong Kong. Aguinaldo took the money and left, but he didn't give up on independence. He used the funds to buy weapons and waited for another opportunity. That opportunity came with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. The U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron, commanded by Commodore George Dewey, was stationed in Hong Kong when war was declared. Dewey had his orders from Theodore Roosevelt himself, issued weeks before the war even started. If war came, Dewey was to sail immediately to the Philippines and destroy the Spanish fleet there. On May 1, 1898, Dewey's ships steamed into Manila Bay at dawn. The Spanish fleet was old, undermanned, and completely outmatched. In a battle that lasted just a few hours, Dewey sank or destroyed every Spanish ship without losing a single American sailor. It was a stunning victory that made Dewey a national hero overnight. But Dewey had a problem. He had destroyed the Spanish fleet, but he didn't have enough men to take Manila or control the islands. He needed help, and he found it in Emilio Aguinaldo. American officials in Hong Kong, with Dewey's knowledge, if not his explicit orders, met with Aguinaldo and suggested he return to the Philippines to fight the Spanish. The Americans, according to Aguinaldo's later testimony, made promises. They told him that America was fighting for Cuban independence and would support Filipino independence too. They said the United States didn't want colonies, that America itself had fought for freedom from colonial rule, and that they would help the Philippines achieve the same. Whether these promises were officially authorized or just the freelancing of individual officials remains disputed, but Aguinaldo believed them. He returned to the Philippines on an American ship in May 1898. What happened next showed just how effective the Filipino revolutionary forces really were. Aguinaldo's army, not the Americans, did most of the fighting against the Spanish on land. Filipino forces swept across Luzon, defeating Spanish garrisons and liberating towns. By June, Aguinaldo had declared Philippine independence and established a revolutionary government with himself as president. His forces surrounded Manila, trapping the remaining Spanish garrison inside the old walled city. The Filipinos had done in months what they'd been trying to do for years. They controlled almost the entire archipelago except for Manila itself. Meanwhile, American troops were finally arriving. Thousands of soldiers sailed from San Francisco, a journey that took weeks. By August, there were enough American forces in Manila Bay for Dewey and the new American commander, General Wesley Merritt, to plan an assault on the city. But they had a delicate problem. The Filipinos had Manila surrounded and had been fighting the Spanish for months. If the city fell, who would control it? The Americans wanted Manila for themselves, but they needed to avoid giving the impression they were pushing aside their Filipino allies. What happened next was a farce, a staged battle that fooled nobody. On August 13, 1898, American and Spanish officers secretly negotiated a surrender. The Spanish agreed to put up token resistance and then surrender the city to the Americans, not to the Filipinos. The Spanish were terrified of Filipino vengeance for 300 years of colonial rule. They preferred to surrender to the Americans, who they saw as fellow Europeans, fellow Christians, and fellow colonial powers. The battle, such as it was, lasted a few hours. American troops marched in, the Spanish surrendered, and Filipino forces were kept outside the city walls. Aguinaldo and his army, the people who had actually defeated the Spanish in most of the Philippines, were shut out of their own capital city. But here's the thing that made everything worse. The Battle of Manila happened one day after Spain and the United States had signed a peace protocol ending the war. The battle was fought after the war was technically over, and the Americans and Spanish both knew it, but neither told the Filipinos. This should have been the first clear sign to Aguinaldo that something was very wrong, but he still hoped that American promises of support for independence were real. Back in the United States, a fierce debate was raging about what to do with the Philippines. The country was deeply divided. On one side were the imperialists, led by Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and supported eventually by President McKinley. They argued that America had a duty to take the Philippines, to civilize and Christianize the Filipinos, even though the Philippines had been Catholic for 300 years. They talked about the white man's burden, about America's destiny to become a great power, about the strategic importance of Manila as a naval base and gateway to Asian markets. They argued that if America didn't take the Philippines, some other power would, probably Germany or Japan. On the other side were the anti-imperialists, a strange coalition that included Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, former President Grover Cleveland, Labour leader Samuel Gompers, and many others. They argued that imperialism betrayed America's founding principles, that a republic couldn't hold colonies without ceasing to be a republic, that conquering the Philippines would be expensive in money and lives, and most importantly, that the Filipinos had a right to govern themselves. Mark Twain was particularly scathing. He suggested that the American flag should have the white stripes painted black and the stars replaced with skull and crossbones. Andrew Carnegie offered to personally buy the Philippines from the U.S. government for $20 million and give the islands their independence, just to prevent America from becoming a colonial power. But President McKinley, after what he described as nights of walking the White House floors and praying for guidance, decided that America would keep the Philippines. His reasoning, as he explained it later to a group of Methodist ministers, was paternalistic and revealing. He said he didn't know what to do with the Philippines at first. He said giving them back to Spain would be cowardly, giving them to France or Germany would be bad business, and leaving them alone would lead to anarchy. So he said there was nothing left to do but take all the islands, educate the Filipinos, uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them as fellow men for whom Christ also died. The stunning ignorance of this statement, the fact that the Philippines had been Christian for centuries, that Manila had universities older than Harvard, that the Filipino educated class spoke Spanish and many spoke English, showed how little American leaders understood about the place they were deciding to rule. In December 1898, Spain and the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, officially ending the Spanish-American War. Spain gave Cuba its independence, sort of. Cuba became a U.S. protectorate with American troops occupying the island and American companies dominating its economy. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam directly to the United States, and Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The Filipino people, who had fought and died for their independence, who had established their own government, had just been sold like a piece of property. They weren't consulted. They weren't invited to the negotiations. They weren't even informed until after the treaty was signed. Spain sold something they no longer controlled to America, and America bought something that didn't belong to Spain in the first place. The treaty had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, and it barely passed. The vote was 57 to 27, just one vote more than the two-thirds majority required. Several anti-imperialist senators who opposed colonialism held their noses and voted yes, because they wanted to formally end the war with Spain, believing they could grant the Philippines independence later. It was one of the most consequential votes in American history, the vote that turned the United States into an overseas colonial empire. In the Philippines, Aguinaldo and the revolutionary government watched these developments with growing alarm and anger. They had declared independence. They had written a constitution, modeled in part on the U.S. Constitution, establishing a democratic republic. They controlled virtually all of the Philippines except for Manila and a few other cities where American troops were stationed. And now they were being told that America owned them, that they had been purchased like livestock. The question wasn't whether there would be a war. The question was when it would start. Tensions escalated through late 1898 and early 1899. American troops in Manila began expanding their perimeter, pushing Filipino forces back. American soldiers and Filipino soldiers faced each other across tense lines. There were incidents, confrontations, insults exchanged. The Americans, many of them volunteers from the western states, looked down on the Filipinos with open racism. They used the same slurs they used for Native Americans and African Americans. They couldn't understand why these people didn't want to be ruled by America. From their perspective, American rule would be an improvement over Spanish rule, so the Filipinos should be grateful. They couldn't or wouldn't understand that the Filipinos didn't want any foreign rule at all, that they wanted the independence they had already declared and won. On the night of February 4, 1899, the war began. The exact details of how it started remain disputed. An American patrol encountered Filipino soldiers on the San Juan Bridge on the outskirts of Manila. There was a confrontation, someone fired a shot, and within minutes both sides were shooting. Within hours, fighting had spread along the entire American perimeter around Manila. The next morning, American forces launched a major offensive, driving back Filipino positions with superior firepower. The Philippine-American War had begun, though the U.S. government wouldn't call it a war. They called it an insurrection, a rebellion. Calling it a war would mean recognizing the Filipino government as a legitimate belligerent, which would undermine the American claim that the Philippines belonged to the United States. So officially, these weren't enemy soldiers. They were insurgents, rebels against lawful American authority. The first phase of the war was conventional warfare, and the Americans won it easily. The U.S. Army had better weapons, better training, better logistics, and more firepower. Aguinaldo's forces fought bravely, but they were outmatched. They had rifles, mostly old Spanish Mausers, but little artillery and no navy. The Americans had modern rifles, machine guns, artillery, and gunboats that could provide fire support along rivers and coastlines. American forces drove north from Manila, defeated the Filipino army in a series of battles, captured the revolutionary capital of Malolos, and pushed Aguinaldo's forces into the mountains. But winning battles didn't mean winning the war. As American forces advanced, they discovered something that would frustrate them for years. The Filipino forces wouldn't stay defeated. They would retreat, regroup, and attack American supply lines and isolated garrisons. The war was transforming from conventional battles into guerrilla warfare, and that's where things got really ugly. The American soldiers who fought in the Philippines came from a United States that was only a generation removed from the Civil War and was in the middle of disenfranchising and terrorizing African Americans in the South. These soldiers brought with them all the racial attitudes of their time, attitudes that saw Filipinos as inferior, as barely human. Letters and newspapers from soldiers in the Philippines are filled with racist language, with casual descriptions of killing that would shock modern readers. One soldier wrote home saying that the troops had orders to kill everyone over the age of 10, turning the countryside into a howling wilderness. Another wrote that he wanted to kill every Filipino he saw until the islands were empty and Americans could repopulate them. Were these official policies? Not exactly, but they weren't entirely unofficial either. The American military command in the Philippines faced a problem. They controlled the cities and towns, but the countryside was hostile. Villagers fed, sheltered, and supported the guerrillas. The guerrillas could disappear into the population, strike at American patrols, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. This is the classic problem of counterinsurgency warfare, and the American solution was brutal. They implemented a policy that essentially aimed to separate the guerrillas from the population by destroying the population's ability to support them. The most notorious example was the reconcentration policy. Filipino civilians in contested areas were forced to move into designated zones, essentially concentration camps, where they could be controlled and prevented from helping the guerrillas. Anyone found outside these zones could be shot as an insurgent. Fields were burned, livestock killed, food supplies destroyed, anything that might help the guerrillas. The goal was to turn the countryside into a wasteland where guerrillas couldn't survive. This policy had already been tried by the Spanish in Cuba, and Americans had condemned it as barbaric when Spain did it. Now America was doing the same thing. The results were predictable and horrific. Thousands of Filipino civilians crowded into unsanitary camps with inadequate food, water, and shelter died from disease, starvation, and exposure. Cholera and malaria swept through the camps. Entire villages disappeared. The war also saw numerous massacres and atrocities. American troops, frustrated by guerrilla tactics and unable to distinguish between civilians and fighters, often killed indiscriminately. One of the most infamous incidents was the Balangiga massacre and its aftermath. In September 1901, Filipino guerrillas in the town of Balangiga on Samar Island surprised an American garrison at breakfast, killing 48 soldiers in a carefully planned attack using machetes and bolos. It was one of the worst American defeats in the war, and the U.S. military responded with systematic brutality. General Jacob Smith was put in charge of operations on Samar, and his orders were explicit. He wanted the interior of Samar turned into a howling wilderness. He told his officers to kill and burn, and the more they killed and burned, the better it would please him. When asked about prisoners, Smith said he wanted no prisoners. When asked about the age limit for killing, Smith reportedly said 10 years old. His subordinate, Major Littleton Waller, protested that these orders were harsh, but Smith insisted. The subsequent campaign on Samar was one of systematic destruction. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, civilians killed. Estimates of Filipino deaths on Samar alone run into the thousands. The water cure became a common torture technique used by American forces. Prisoners or suspected guerrillas, or sometimes just civilians, would be held down, their mouths forced open, and water poured down their throats until their stomachs distended. Then soldiers would beat or jump on the prisoner's stomach, forcing the water out, and repeat the process. The goal was to extract information about guerrilla movements or weapon caches, but it was often just sadistic punishment. The water cure, of course, is what we now call waterboarding, and the debates about whether it constitutes torture have echoed across more than a century. The war saw other atrocities too. Entire villages suspected of supporting guerrillas were massacred. Prisoners were executed. Wounded fighters were shot where they lay. Church bells were stolen and sent back to the United States as war trophies, bells that had been cast centuries earlier and represented irreplaceable cultural heritage. The American military justified these actions as necessary measures against a savage foe who didn't fight by civilized rules. But Filipino fighters saw themselves as patriots defending their homeland against foreign invaders, doing exactly what Americans had done in the Revolutionary War. Back in the United States, news of these atrocities began to filter home. Anti-imperialist groups seized on them as proof that imperialism corrupted American values and turned American soldiers into war criminals. Newspapers published letters from soldiers describing atrocities. Veterans came home and testified before Congress about what they had seen and done. There were military courts martial, including the trial of General Jacob Smith, who was convicted and forced to retire but served no jail time. There were congressional investigations and public debates. But most Americans didn't care or didn't care enough. The war was far away, affecting people most Americans had never heard of and couldn't find on a map. American casualties were relatively light compared to the Civil War still in living memory, and the racial attitudes of the time made it easy for Americans to dismiss Filipino deaths as unfortunate but necessary, the price of civilization and progress. When anti-imperialists talked about Filipino suffering, pro-imperialist voices countered with stories of American soldiers killed by guerrillas, of treacherous attacks, of the need to teach the Filipinos a lesson. The war also had its heroes and complications that make simple narratives difficult. Not all American soldiers committed atrocities. Many tried to treat Filipinos decently, built schools and hospitals, and genuinely believed they were helping. Some American officers spoke out against the brutality and tried to enforce more humane policies. And the Filipino side wasn't uniformly noble either. There were massacres of civilians suspected of collaborating with Americans. There were brutal punishments of Filipinos who refused to support the revolution. There were regional and class divisions within Filipino society that complicated the independence movement. But these complications don't change the fundamental facts. The United States took the Philippines by force, fought a war to suppress Filipino independence, and that war killed hundreds of thousands of people. The exact death toll has been debated for over a century. The U.S. military reported about 4,200 American soldiers killed, about 1,000 in combat, and the rest from disease. They reported killing about 20,000 Filipino soldiers. But those numbers don't capture the full horror. The civilian death toll was catastrophic. Conservative estimates put civilian deaths at around 200,000. More recent scholarship suggests the number might be as high as 750,000 or even 1 million when you include deaths from war-related famine and disease. The population of the Philippines actually declined during the war years, something that only happens during truly devastating conflicts. Entire provinces were depopulated. The war and occupation disrupted agriculture, leading to famines. Cholera epidemics swept through the islands. People who survived the fighting died of starvation and disease in its aftermath. Consider what 200,000 deaths meant in the context of the Philippine population at the time. The Philippines had maybe 7 or 8 million people. A death toll of 200,000 represents about 2 to 3% of the entire population killed in just a few years. For comparison, if the United States today experienced casualties at the same rate, it would mean 6 to 10 million dead. That's the scale of devastation the Philippine-American War inflicted on the Filipino people. The conventional war phase lasted until 1902, when the U.S. captured Aguinaldo through a clever piece of intelligence work. American forces intercepted a message and used it to locate Aguinaldo's hideout in northern Luzon. A small force of American soldiers and Filipino scouts, some of them dressed as prisoners, infiltrated the camp and captured Aguinaldo without a fight. It was a bloodless coup that effectively ended organized resistance. Aguinaldo, in captivity, issued a proclamation urging his followers to accept American sovereignty and end the fighting. Many did, but many others didn't. The war officially ended on July 4, 1902, when President Theodore Roosevelt, who had succeeded McKinley after his assassination, declared victory and granted amnesty to most Filipino fighters. But fighting continued in some areas, particularly in the Muslim South, where the Moro people resisted American rule just as they had resisted Spanish rule. The Moro resistance continued until 1913, a full 15 years after Dewey's victory in Manila Bay. Even that date is somewhat arbitrary. There were incidents, uprisings, and fighting in the Philippines throughout the American colonial period. So what did America gain from all this blood and treasure? The Philippines became an American colony, though the U.S. government preferred terms like territory or possession. The U.S. established a colonial government with an American governor-general and slowly, very slowly, began including Filipinos in governance. The U.S. built schools and introduced English as the language of instruction, creating a Filipino-educated class that spoke English and studied American history and literature. American companies invested in Philippine agriculture and resources. The U.S. Navy got its base in Manila Bay, and America became a Pacific power with the strategic presence that leaders like Roosevelt and Lodge had wanted. But the cost of this empire was higher than anyone had predicted. The war cost hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when that was real money. It cost thousands of American lives. It cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. It divided American society and sparked a debate about American identity that has never really ended. And it established patterns that would repeat throughout the 20th century, the pattern of American intervention overseas, the pattern of underestimating nationalist resistance, the pattern of military tactics that blurred the line between combatants and civilians, the pattern of a gap between American ideals and American actions. The war also revealed something about the limits of American power and American idealism. The United States went into the Philippines claiming to bring civilization, democracy, and progress. Many Americans genuinely believed that's what they were doing. They built schools, hospitals, and roads. They introduced modern sanitation and public health measures. They established courts and a legal system. And eventually, after nearly 50 years of colonial rule, the United States did grant the Philippines independence. something that distinguishes American colonialism from European colonialism in some ways. But all of this was built on a foundation of conquest and violence. The schools were built after villages were burned. The democracy was introduced after a war that killed hundreds of thousands. The independence was granted decades later than Filipinos wanted it. And when independence finally came in 1946, it came with strings attached, with military bases that remained under U.S. control, with an economy structured to serve American interests, with a political system shaped by decades of American influence. The Philippine-American War also had lasting effects on both American and Filipino society. In America, it marked the country's transformation from a continental republic into an overseas empire. It established precedents for American military intervention in foreign countries, precedents that would be followed in the Caribbean, in Central America, and eventually around the world. It showed that America could fight a guerrilla war far from home, and it taught lessons about counterinsurgency that the military would apply with varying success in future conflicts. For the Philippines, the war was a national trauma that shaped the country's development for generations. It killed a substantial portion of the population. It disrupted traditional society. It created a Filipino elite educated in American schools and oriented toward America. It established English as a national language alongside Filipino languages. It created economic dependencies that persisted long after independence. And it left complicated feelings toward America, a mixture of gratitude for eventual independence and economic opportunities, resentment of colonial domination, and ongoing debates about what independence really means when your former colonizer remains your major ally and economic partner. The war also had effects that rippled beyond the Philippines. It influenced how other colonized peoples viewed America. Before 1898, America had been seen by many anti-colonial movements as a model, a former colony that had won its independence and become a great power. After the Philippine-American War, that reputation was tarnished. Ho Chi Minh, years later, would cite the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence when demanding Vietnamese independence from France. But he would also remember that America had suppressed Filipino independence. Colonized peoples around the world learned that America's anti-colonial rhetoric didn't necessarily apply to non-white peoples seeking independence. The war is mostly forgotten in America today. If Americans learn about it at all, it's usually a brief mention in history classes, a footnote between the Spanish-American War and World War I. The Philippines themselves are often forgotten in American consciousness, despite the long colonial relationship, and despite the fact that millions of Filipino Americans live in the United States today. This forgetting is itself significant. It shows how America has dealt with the uncomfortable parts of its history by simply not teaching them, not talking about them, not remembering them. In the Philippines, the war is remembered differently. It's taught in schools. There are monuments to the fallen. Aguinaldo and other revolutionary leaders are national heroes. The war is part of the national narrative of struggle for independence. But even in the Philippines, the memory is complicated by the reality that America eventually granted independence, that America rebuilt the country after World War II, that millions of Filipinos have emigrated to America and sent remittances home, that America remains a major ally and economic partner. It's hard to maintain pure anger toward your former colonizer when your economy depends on them and your children dream of moving there. The Philippine-American War also raises uncomfortable questions about American exceptionalism, the belief that America is different from other nations, that American power is benevolent, that American intervention in other countries is motivated by idealism rather than self-interest. The war shows that America, when it suited American interests, could act just like any other imperial power. The rhetoric about civilization and uplift and democracy was sincere. Many Americans really did believe it, but it was also a rationalization for conquest and domination. The war shows the gap between American ideals and American actions, a gap that has persisted in American foreign policy ever since. Consider the parallels to later American conflicts. The village pacification programs in the Philippines look a lot like the strategic Hamlet program in Vietnam. The torture techniques used in the Philippines were used again in the War on Terror. The difficulty of distinguishing guerrillas from civilians that frustrated American forces in the Philippines would frustrate them again in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. The pattern of underestimating nationalist resistance, of expecting to be welcomed as liberators, of getting bogged down in counterinsurgency warfare, repeats across a century of American military interventions. The war also complicates narratives about race and empire. The American forces that fought in the Philippines included African American soldiers, the famous Buffalo Soldiers, and other black regiments. These men fought for an America that denied them basic rights, that lynched them and segregated them. Some African American soldiers deserted and fought for the Filipinos, recognizing a common struggle against white supremacy. Others remained loyal, seeing military service as a path to respect and citizenship. The Filipino revolutionaries themselves were not racially uniform. The elite leadership was often lighter-skinned, often of Spanish or mixed ancestry. The common soldiers were darker, often from indigenous groups. These racial complexities don't fit neatly into simple stories of white colonizers and brown colonized. The economic dimensions of the war are also important to understand. American business interests in the Philippines before 1898 were minimal, but they grew rapidly during the colonial period. American companies invested in sugar plantations, in mining, in logging, in trade. The Philippines became a source of raw materials and a market for American manufactured goods. The colonial economy was structured to benefit American business, with tariffs designed to favor American imports and with land laws that allowed American companies to acquire large holdings. This economic relationship continued even after independence, and critics argue it represents a form of neo-colonialism, political independence without economic independence. The war also had implications for international law and norms. The Treaty of Paris, which sold the Philippines to the United States, ignored the principle of self-determination that was beginning to emerge in international discourse. The conduct of the war, the use of reconcentration camps, and systematic destruction of civilian areas violated emerging norms about how wars should be fought. The US justified these actions as necessary against an uncivilized enemy, but that same logic would be used by other powers to justify colonial atrocities. The war contributed to a climate where powerful nations felt entitled to conquer and rule weaker peoples, a climate that would lead to the horrors of colonialism in Africa and Asia in the early 20th century. There's also the question of what might have been. What if the United States had honored its implied promises to Aguinaldo and supported Philippine independence in 1898? The Philippines would have become independent 50 years earlier, before the devastation of the Philippine-American War. They would have avoided the destruction and death toll, but they also might have faced other challenges. Would an independent Philippines in 1898 have been able to maintain its independence against Japanese expansionism in the 1930s and 1940s? Would it have faced civil war between different regions and ethnic groups? Would another colonial power have seized control? These questions are unanswerable, but they remind us that history is contingent, that different choices lead to different outcomes. The legacy of the war extends into the present day. The special relationship between the United States and the Philippines, the millions of Filipino Americans, the military alliance, the economic ties, all have roots in the colonial relationship established by the war. American military bases remained in the Philippines until 1992, nearly a century after Dewey sailed into Manila Bay. The Philippine government and military continue to train with and purchase equipment from the United States. English remains a major language in the Philippines, giving Filipinos advantages in the global economy, but also marking the country's colonial past. The war also offers lessons about the costs of empire that remain relevant today. Empires are expensive, in money and in lives and in moral authority. They create commitments that outlast their original justifications. They generate resistance that is often more determined and effective than the imperial power expects. They force the imperial power to choose between living up to its ideals and maintaining control, and when push comes to shove, control usually wins. The United States learned these lessons in the Philippines between 1899 and 1902, but the lessons didn't stick, and America would have to learn them again in later conflicts. Perhaps the most important lesson is about the human cost of viewing other people as inferior, as needing to be civilized or saved or controlled. The racism that allowed American soldiers to kill Filipino civilians without remorse, that allowed American politicians to justify colonialism as benevolent, that allowed American citizens to ignore or excuse atrocities, that racism was not an aberration. It was central to the entire enterprise. You cannot have an empire of liberty. You cannot conquer people for their own good. The rhetoric of civilization and progress and uplift cannot disguise or justify the reality of domination and violence. The Philippines paid the price for Americans learning this lesson, and even then, the lesson wasn't really learned. Standing back and looking at the whole picture, the Philippine-American War was a pivotal moment in American history, a moment when the United States made a choice about what kind of country it would be. It chose empire over republic, expansion over isolation, power over principle. That choice brought benefits. There's no denying that America's position as a Pacific power has shaped the modern world. But it also brought costs that we are still calculating. It cost 200,000 or more Filipino lives. It cost American lives and American treasure. It cost American innocence and American claims to moral superiority. It established patterns of intervention and counterinsurgency that would be repeated throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, and it created a complicated legacy that both countries continue to navigate. The war deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote, but as a major event that shaped both American and Filipino history. It deserves to be taught in schools, discussed in public discourse, and understood as part of the American story. Not to shame America or celebrate the Philippines, but to understand the complex realities of power, the costs of empire, the persistence of racism, and the ways that choices made over a century ago continue to shape the present. The Filipino people who fought and died for independence deserve to be remembered. The American soldiers who fought and died, whether they understood what they were fighting for or not, deserve to be remembered. And the civilians caught in between, the hundreds of thousands who died in a war they didn't start and couldn't stop, they especially deserve to be remembered. Their stories, their suffering, their resistance, their hope for independence, all of it is part of our shared history, and forgetting it doesn't make it go away.